Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee around here, and we have a great show for you today. It is Monday, August 5th, and we're going to start talking a little bit about Michigan, all of the different things going on around there. There was a ton of different information that came out yesterday that I want to break down for you all. Definitely some very interesting stuff that we'll break down, and definitely some stuff that is going to change the next couple of months, that is for sure. Then we'll get into one of the more under-talked about big differences in today's college football, which is the travel that a lot of these teams are going to have to face. We'll go through all of the teams in the Big Ten, and then we'll get to the big team that really exemplifies this, which is Cal, and we'll break down exactly why that is in that segment. Then we'll get into the players that just have to have a good fall camp. We'll get into the major four teams going into the season right on this segment, but we'll continue to unpack it throughout the week. There are a couple of guys that just have to perform, and they have to perform pretty much right away, so we'll break down those for Georgia, Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State. Then we're going to do a little bit of a fall camp update, bounce around to a ton of different camps because there is a ton of updates pretty much every day. We'll probably do this pretty much every day from this point forward as we get closer and closer to the season because there is a ton to break down. Before we finish it out with a recruiting update, a ton happened this weekend. Auburn and Oregon got huge commitments, so we'll break it down for you all today. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that is GSMCpodcast.net. But let's jump right in with this Sherrone Moore news. There is a ton going on over at Michigan, and the NCAA has kind of started to roll out some different NOAs, notice of allegations, to Michigan, and one just got leaked, which is not necessarily the ideal way of going about business if you're the NCAA, but there's a really good reason that they did this, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So the gist of this, there is a ton of different things that have happened around Michigan, and a ton of different things to kind of unpack in this segment, but the big thing is Sherrone Moore is more involved than we thought he was prior. In the first draft, I suppose, of these notice of allegations, he was not involved. He was not named in those notices, so it felt like he was kind of off a little bit. He wasn't necessarily super involved. It seems like he's a little bit more involved than we once thought, and it's not necessarily anything egregious, but he definitely was involved to a certain extent because it sounds like he deleted 52 text messages between him and Connor Stalions on October 23rd when all of this started to come out, and all of that stuff was already in the deleted folder, so take that with what you will. You know, you never know what exactly those texts were. I tend to believe it wasn't asking him what he wants to do for lunch that day or if he's doing all right, so I tend to think it was something, but you never really know what it was. The NCAA does, and they're not bringing him towards for a level 1 violation. That is something that I believe 5 other coaches on the 2023 staff are facing. All of those coaches no longer coach in college football, including that guy right there. Jim Harbaugh was involved in this, has gotten some allegations against him, including a level 1 violation. It sounds like that's not going to be a big problem for him because he's not going to come back to college. I think he's going to stay in the NFL, and once he's done there, will likely retire. So I don't think it really hurts Jim Harbaugh in really any way. But if he were to come back to college, then there would be some rules that have to be put into place for him around that. And then one of the other big things is actually this thing that I'm showing you right here. Connor Stalions was on the sideline for that CMU Michigan State game. And a lot of people had speculated this in the past, and it's been something that we felt pretty confident that was him. We know who that guy is, but at the end of the day, we wanted the confirmation. Well, we've gotten it. That was Connor Stalions on the sideline. He was wearing coaching attire. He had a sideline pass. He had everything in between. They don't know how he got it. I would have to imagine it didn't just take Connor Stalions to get that, but that's beside the point. It's definitely something that will be a huge, huge point of this case, and frankly, I'd be hard-pressed, you'd be hard-pressed to get me to believe that that's the first time that he's done that. But that's something that we absolutely will learn more about as we kind of get further on throughout this process. But One of the other things that came out was some of the different level 1 violations against some of these different people. Jesse Minter was involved, as well as Chris Partridge, who is no longer with the team, was fired back in October, kind of around when all of this stuff started to come out. Denard Robinson was let go from the team after a DUI arrest back in February. Jim Harbaugh, obviously, off to the NFL. So pretty much all of these guys are okay. Chris Partridge is now up in the NFL as well, with the Seahawks, with old Michigan defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald. So they're going to be fine. If they ever find their way back into college sports, particularly Denard Robinson, who I assume would like to get back into college football, he'll likely have to face some type of show cause, some type of thing going when he comes back into the sport. So that'll be something that's very interesting to watch. But overall, a lot of the guys that are, named in this case outside of Sherrone Moore are no longer with that program, are no longer even in college football. So it's kind of hard to get an idea of how aggressively this will affect them, at least in the short term. It really won't affect them too much at all. And then another big thing here was just kind of the details around how big of a deal or how big of an operation was this, how many people were involved, how many people, knew about it and did nothing. That's kind of still in a gray area. We're not exactly sure how many people knew. We do know that at least 13 former Michigan opponents were scouted on 58 different occasions from 21 to 23. So we know that it happened up until last year. And we know that at some point during last year, they were off scouting other programs. It sounds like it was a ton of interns, and Connor Stalions kind of leading a group of interns to do this. And from the interns' point of view, it didn't look like they were breaking any rules. And I kind of understand where they're coming from. If you're an intern, you're not necessarily the most in tune with all of the rules in the NCAA. You looking at someone else's signs and trying to discern what is happening on that play doesn't feel that intense, right? It doesn't feel like you're breaking any rules. It just feels like you're scouting at the end of the day. Only the people higher up would know that that is an issue, and Connor Stalions being one of them. So obviously this is something that is going to be a big deal. It sounds like the interns that were involved in this had no idea that they were doing anything wrong, and frankly, I kind of agree with them. I don't necessarily think it's crazy to think that they just came in, got an assignment from their boss, and said, yeah, this makes sense. This is football scouting. But it obviously crossed a line, and definitely it was a huge deal. It sounds like one full-time staffer did know about this going on. I doubt that he is still with the team. He was not named in this, so I can't imagine he's still with the team, but we'll see what happens there. Definitely some more things that could unfold. Maybe it was Chris Partridge, and that's why he was let go so abruptly during the last season. But overall, there are a lot of things that are that have to be unpacked here. There's no two ways about that. The biggest thing here that I've seen, time and again, there's so many different, ers and ahs within this, and a lot of the ers and ahs have a but after it. You have Sherrone Moore deleted a ton of text to Connor Stalions. But the NCAA looked at those texts and decided that it wasn't a level 1 violation, so he wasn't involved in any lack of institutional control, that type of thing that is, really, really serious. So he is more a level 2 violation. So that's kind of, you don't really know what those text messages entail. It sounds like Connor Stalions had his little crew that, did a lot of these scouting projects throughout the country, 58 different occasions throughout the last couple of years. And frankly, I would be shocked if there weren't more than 58 and they just found 58, but that's beside the point. I do think there are a ton of things that, yes, he had his little crew. It's hard for me to outright say that everyone else in that program absolutely knew entirely what was going on. Now, I don't necessarily, I do think they knew to a certain extent what was going on. I'm not sitting here and saying that Connor Stalions went entirely rogue and was totally acting on his own, but I do think there were some things that were happening behind those closed doors that were kind of Connor Stalions and Connor Stalions only. And he definitely kind of took full control of this. And it's not to say that, Sherrone Moore didn't have an idea of what was going on or Jim Harbaugh wasn't involved in some form or another. But it is to say, at least as of right now, that can't necessarily be said with absolute confidence. And I think that's obviously the biggest thing here. You have to prove this from an NCAA perspective. You have to prove this without doubt. You have to make sure that you know that this happened, we know how it happened, it was everyone in the program was involved, all of these different things really have to come into place. And from what I've read, there are a lot of big-time things in here. There are a lot of big-time kind of condemning things around Michigan football. But at the end of the day, there's not a ton that can really pin really aggressive stuff against them. There's tons of stuff that can happen here. Like Sherrone Moore, there is a reality where he could be suspended to open the season, which would obviously be a huge deal because you got Texas coming in there in week 2, and if you're suspended for any more than 1 week, Michigan's fighting an uphill battle in a game that they were already likely fighting an uphill battle in. So that's obviously going to be something to watch. There are a ton of different things that will continue to come out on this, and frankly, it came out right now because you got a Netflix doc coming at the end of the month around Connor Stallions, and you want to get out ahead of that. I have no doubt that is why this came out when it did and as soon as it did. So I definitely think that's going to play a part, and we'll see what happens with the Netflix documentary. I've talked about it a little bit. Don't necessarily have a ton of faith that the full story is going to be told, but I feel pretty confident in who the villain's going to be at this point, and I think it's going to be the NCAA, and I think Connor Stallions is going to have plenty to say. I'll just put it that way. But overall, I think when you look at this thing, there's so many different tidbits in this that are really, really interesting and kind of, really condemning and to a certain extent around Michigan football. When you have your head coach deleting 52 text messages to a staffer that's in the middle of this, doesn't necessarily look that good. When you have, a little group, a little action force in your football program that is going out on 58 different occasions to go scout other teams, that's really tough, and definitely something that they're going to have to act on. You have a ton of other coaches that are involved in level 1 violations. You have Connor Stallions, we know, was on the sideline for the CMU game. There's tons of stuff here, and you can definitely, there will absolutely be some type of punishment that comes down the road, whether it's a suspension for Sherrone Moore, whether it's a big-time fine for the university, a postseason ban, whatever that looks like. There's something coming down the chute, but to me, a lot of this feels like the NCAA being none too happy with Michigan in a lot of ways, not loving the way that Michigan went about this, and it sounds like they were rather defiant against the NCAA, and frankly, I'd say they're wrong to do that. I would argue that they're right to do that because the NCAA in past years has not necessarily fared too well when a team has fought against them, and I would do the exact same thing, but it is one of those things that you got a lot of new information around the Sherrone Moore case, and absolutely will be something that will continue to unpack throughout the month, especially after that documentary comes out. It will take a little bit for this to develop. I believe they have 90 days to respond to this, so still a little bit of months down the road before we get a full conclusion to this thing, but definitely some real allegations here, and definitely some stuff that is going to be a big deal and possibly could lead to Michigan getting a postseason ban or getting some more aggressive violations down the road. So it'll be very interesting to watch that. But overall, I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath over the next week that we're going to get a big-time Michigan, landslide. I think it's going to take a while, but maybe it'll come in time. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the biggest unknowns in college football this year, which is the travel that some teams will have to face, specifically the teams out on the West Coast. So we'll break down those teams right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things happening around that Michigan case. Definitely some real news that came out yesterday and some more news that could hurt Michigan in the long run. But as of right now, it feels like it's a lot of the NCAA just not being too happy about them not complying with this case the way that they like. So it'll definitely be an interesting thing to kind of unpack over the next little bit. And there are going to be some punishments coming for Michigan, maybe in a couple of months here, but definitely something that will be at least substantial enough to talk about. No two ways about that. But let's get into one of the big time factors that might be a little bit under talked about. There's been some people that have talked about it in passing, but travel is kind of a new thing in this sport. Obviously, you have people traveling every single week for games. That's not the new part of this by any means, but you have a lot of teams traveling across time zones. You have a lot of teams traveling from the Pacific to the Eastern time zone to play a game, and they're going to be traveling on a Thursday, and they got to lace them up at noon on a Saturday. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, and so many different things that can kind of get in your way when you get into this. And the teams that I really want to break down here are the teams out in the West that are joining the Big Ten this year, and then one team in the ACC, well, both teams in the ACC really, that are really going to face this most aggressively, Cal and Stanford, and we'll break down how just insane their travel is for this upcoming year. But let's start with a team that everyone's watching very, very closely in the Big Ten, in the Oregon Ducks. They are the team that everyone's pointing to as the big-time players this upcoming year, the team that is fully ready to contend, and there's no two ways about that. When you look at the roster, the coaching staff, the players, everything is in place for this team to win a national title. They do have to play games that they didn't have to play in the past by any means. They have to travel to Michigan. They have to travel to Purdue. They have to travel to Wisconsin. And that, while it's not nearly as bad as some of the other new Big Ten teams have to face, it is going to be a factor. It is going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. And to give you an idea, the gap between UCLA and Oregon, which is the furthest team from Oregon among the teams that were in the Pac-12 before and are now in the Big Ten, that's only 729 miles. And some of these other trips are closer to double that. When you go to Michigan, when you go to Wisconsin and Purdue, those are definitely going to be double that distance, and you're going to be crossing time zone, which is kind of the bigger thing here. I think everyone can handle a long plane flight, especially, compared to 1 hour down to UCLA or a couple hours down to UCLA, 4 hours over to Michigan. Not necessarily the craziest thing in the world by any means, but when you talk about the time zone change, that is going to factor in. And when you talk about Big Ten football, margins are everything. So there's no two ways that this could absolutely cause a problem for Oregon. And I think that Wisconsin game is really interesting. It's a very interesting part of the schedule, but also making that travel is not going to be easy into an environment that is not going to be easy. So there is a reality where Michigan drops one of those games that you're not expecting, and you might just have to point to travel as one of those big time reasons. USC is moving into the Big Ten as well, and they have a little bit further of a trip than some of these guys for some of the other teams, because some of those teams are just a little bit more north. When you have to go to Michigan, Maryland, and especially Minnesota, you got to go really north to get up there. So not necessarily the best thing for them. Obviously, going to Michigan is the toughest test because of the team on the other side, but when you got to go all the way over to Maryland, all the way over to College Park and play a really, really explosive offense against a rather suspect defense, I'll put it that way nicely, but at the end of the day, this thing could get really sketchy really quickly for the Trojans if they're not careful. You're totally changing your sleep schedule. It's a lot of different things that go into this, and a lot of things that a USC player has really not had to deal with. Obviously, traveling to South Bend is definitely a big-time flight and one they have to deal with every now and then, but overall, it's going to be an entirely different ball game, and absolutely will play a factor into that game, and especially a team that's going to get up and down, that's going to make you run. It'll be interesting, that's for sure. Washington travels to Penn State, Iowa, and Rutgers. Rutgers is the one. That is a very, very long way away, but they make 2 trips over 2,000 miles this year. That's quite the trip. There's no two ways about that. And they go from the Pacific to the Eastern time zone twice when they go to Penn State and Rutgers. Not going to be easy. And Rutgers is a very good team. They are a team that is not going to give you an inch. They are going to play the game the exact right way. They're not going to get a ton of penalties. They're not going to make some of the mistakes that they did a year ago. And a lot of the things are going to come into place that it might not be the most clean game in the world from Rutgers. It might not be the prettiest thing in the world, but it's going to cause issues for teams. And I think Washington's a team that you could go out there and think, we have the better quarterback, we have the better wide receivers, we have a lot of the better players overall. But Rutgers has the home field. They didn't have to travel to get there. They didn't have to take the 5-hour plane ride. Maybe they got better sleep than Washington did. A lot of these little things that, frankly, didn't play nearly as big of an impact prior to this are absolutely going to be huge this upcoming year. So Washington could lose that game going all the way to Rutgers, and you could, again, point to that travel as a big-time reason for that. And then finally, UCLA has a very interesting schedule because last year it was a lot easier. They traveled to Hawaii, LSU, Penn State, Rutgers, Nebraska, and Washington this year. That is quite the trip. There's no two ways about that. They're going to be flying all over the place, especially that trip to Hawaii is going to be quite the trip. But you compare it to last year when they had to go to San Diego State, Utah, Oregon State, Stanford, Arizona, and USC. A lot of those are right around them. There's no two ways about that. They only had to leave their time zone once when they had to go to Arizona. So it's a very, very, or I guess Utah would be one as well. But it definitely will be a really, really interesting thing. They're leaving their time zone 5 times in 2024. Will absolutely play a part in this team. And frankly, this is going to be a tough team in general. I think they're not necessarily going to have the best year in the Big Ten, and it'll go beyond the travel. But UCLA is not necessarily getting the best cut of the best cut of the new teams going into the Big Ten as you talk about travel, because they face a lot of games that are just going to be nightmares in terms of travel. But one of the best examples happens in the ACC, though, because what Cal is up against this year is just unfair, I think is the best way to put it. There's so many different stats that have come out about the travel that they're going to have to face this year, and I think the biggest one is they travel 83.2% around the circumference of the earth in their road games this year. They have 5 road games. It's not like they have 7 road games compared to 5 at home, and that helps that out a little bit. They're traveling 4,180 miles every week. That's their average of every single week throughout the year. That is absolutely ridiculous, especially when you look at some of the other teams in the conference where Florida State is just above that, about 4,400 miles. When you look at Pittsburgh, 4,500. Wake Forest, 4,600. SMU, only 2,900. And that's not the average. That's the entirety of the year for these teams is almost the same as the average every week for Cal for out-of-conference games. So Cal's up against it. There's no two ways about that. I think they travel more in their 5 road games than 26 of the 32 NFL teams do in their, I believe, 8 road games or 9 road games, depending on how you cut it. So it's ridiculous. There's really no other way to put it. It's absolutely insane that they're going to have to face this, and this is a really fun team. This is a team that absolutely could have a lot to say in this conference because of that guy right there, Jay Knott, being one of the best players in that conference. But overall, it's insane to have these kids expected to, rise to that occasion. I think it's going to be a team that plays a lot of close games, plays it really tough, but at the end of the day, loses more games than they probably should because traveling all the way over there every single week is going to be an absolute nightmare. So whether it's, traveling out to Syracuse or traveling out to Virginia or Virginia Tech, there's not an easy travel for any of the games that Cal plays. I think they do play SMU, if I'm not mistaken, in Dallas, so that one's not quite as bad, but if that's your easiest one, then that's a nightmare. They do play Stanford, so that's a layup, but other than that, Cal's up against it, and it's an absolute nightmare. And then you go into the other team that we talk about in the ACC, Stanford, and they're expected to travel about 14,000 miles, and the second most in the ACC, of course, because there are 2 teams out in the ACC that are getting a very raw deal when it comes to geographic proximity to the teams in that conference. But they do have road dates against Syracuse and Clemson in consecutive weeks, which is a absolute nightmare. Traveling up to New York, then back to Palo Alto, then back out to Clemson is not going to be an easy thing in the world. And frankly, I would not be surprised if they lost both of those games. But then they have a trip to Notre Dame, and then they have NC State 2 weeks after that. It's just it's a nightmare for the Cardinal. I think you look at Cal's schedule, there's a little bit more spread out when it comes to the travel that they're going to have to make. Stanford gets a lot of it in a very short amount of time, so that could be a really, really tough stretch for them. There's no two ways about that. So they are spared a little bit. They do play Cal. They do play San Houston State. So not necessarily too bad at the back end of that schedule, but overall, it's a nightmare. There's no two ways about that. And I think when you look at a lot of these teams, not necessarily all of them or most of them really are not necessarily looking at this year as a national title year. I think when you talk about these teams, Oregon is the team that you circle and say that is a national title level team. They absolutely can make noise there, but there's a wrinkle here. There's no two ways about that. There is something that could absolutely cause a problem for Oregon this year, and you're going to play Michigan. You're going to play Wisconsin. You're not going to play, well, you are going to play Purdue, but you're not going to play Northwestern. You're not going to play some of the teams that you should just be able to show up, be physically more powerful, and beat. That's just the reality of some of these games. That likely will be the reality in the Purdue game. That's not going to be the reality in the Michigan game. I can promise you that. And the Wisconsin game, maybe a little bit, but much less so than they're expecting. And I think it's one of those games where if you're not careful, and Wisconsin especially is on their game that day, and they know that you're coming in a little bit sluggish with a little bit of jet lag, that's all you need. When you talk about this upcoming college football season, I think the biggest thing here is these are going to be margin games pretty much all throughout the year. I haven't seen a conference, at least from my point of view. When you look at the SEC, it is Oregon and Ohio State. When you look at the SEC, when you look at the SEC, it's Texas and Georgia. When you look at the Big Ten, it's Ohio State and Oregon. When you look everywhere else, you can pick out Utah in the Big 12. You can pick out Florida State and Clemson in the ACC. I wouldn't necessarily say there is a big drop-off anywhere in really any of these conferences. I think when you look at the SEC, there's about 7 teams that can make some noise. So maybe Texas having to make some of the travel that they haven't made in the past, or Oklahoma especially having to make the travel over to Auburn and that type of thing. Much less aggressive than what Cal has to deal with, but it absolutely is something that could play into the mix. So I think overall, when you look at this season, there's so many different variables that go into this season, and winning a lot of those variables is going to be the one that, finds a way to win that national title at the end of the year. But travel is one that some just can't control, and especially the ones out on the West Coast that join some of these big-time conferences. You're going to be up against it. There's no two ways about that, and you're going to have to deal with some stuff that Georgia, that Texas, that some of these big-time teams just don't have to deal with quite as aggressively, especially that Ohio State against Oregon battle. Ohio State doesn't have to travel nearly as much as Oregon does, and that could be the difference between who wins that conference and who comes out just a little bit short. So we'll break that down, obviously, throughout the season and see how much that really plays a part. I tend to believe it's going to be a huge factor, but maybe these teams don't care at all, and they just get off the plane totally refreshed and dominate a team. But we'll break that down throughout the season. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down some of the big-time players in fall camp. When you look across all of the contenders this year, there are a couple of players that need to make the most out of fall camp, and if they don't, you got some real problems going into the year. So we'll break that down for the major 4 teams, Texas, Georgia, Oregon, and Ohio State, right after this. So stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going into this season and how travel is one of the big time things that is kind of being introduced for a number of different teams that is going to be really more aggressive than it ever has been and definitely will play a big time part in this upcoming season. But let's get into the players that just have to make the most of their fall camp. There are so many players across the country for so many contenders that you need to hit. You need to have big-time camps going into a big-time fall, and we'll break down those players. We'll get into Texas, Georgia, Oregon, and Ohio State today. We'll get into plenty more throughout the week. I can promise you that, because there are a ton of players to break down. There's no two ways about that. But let's get into this real quick, and I want to start over in Texas, and I'm going to start with Alfred Collins. Frankly, I think this might be the most important player on the defensive side of the ball for Texas this upcoming year. I think when you look at this team, they lost T'Vondre Sweat. They lost Byron Murphy. They are not getting those two guys back. I can promise you, Vernon Broughton and Alfred Collins, I think, are both really good players, and frankly, I think are going to be a more than fine duo for them in the middle, but they are not those two people. They are not T'Vondre Sweat. They are not Byron Murphy, and they're going to have to figure out a way to kind of the way that Josh Pate put it, I believe yesterday, was a Moneyball quote. You got to recreate them in the aggregate. You can't necessarily do it all at once. You're not going to have two players that just plug in and become T'Vondre Sweat and become Byron Murphy. But you can figure it out with a number of different players. So Alfred Collins is just a piece of this. You really have to have the entire defensive tackle group come along pretty well throughout this fall camp. But Alfred Collins is the guy that I just think is going to be a really, really good player if everything clicks. His athleticism is absolutely off the charts. More of that Byron Murphy type player that can be a little bit more rangy, a little bit more athletic, more of a pass rusher, absolutely, from that defensive tackle position. So I do think he's one of those guys that just holds a lot of power for this team. When you look at the defensive tackle position, you don't just need Vernon Broughton, who has had a number of really good reviews throughout the first couple of days in fall camp, and I expect to be a big-time player for them this year. I think Collins is the one that really opens a ton of different doors. He's the one that totally makes this defense pretty much what they were a year ago. They're not going to be a top 3 run defense, I can almost promise you that, but absolutely can be much better than people expect them to be, and I think Alfred Collins would play a huge part in that. And then when you look at the back end of this defense, Javion Cole is someone that I'm watching very, very closely. He came over from San Jose State, as you can see, had 7 picks while he was there, and is definitely someone that they're going to have big-time snaps from throughout the season. And a lot of this stuff is going to be very interesting because the way Texas is lining up on the back end is changing pretty consistently. There's no real rhyme or reason, at least as of right this second, for how they're going about business on the back end, and we don't exactly know who's going to be a starter, who's not, but I can promise you Javion Cole is going to play a ton, and he's absolutely someone that's going to have to come in for someone like Manny Muhammad or someone like Jahdae Barron at that corner position and play really, really good minutes. And I think the biggest thing for this Texas back end is last year there was a lot of things that just had to fit. There was a lot of things that had to go their way, whether it was the safeties having to come together where it was a relatively young group a year ago, or someone like Manny Muhammad who was a freshman. He had to hit last year. There was no two ways about that for them to have a good pass defense, and he did hit. He was a very good player, but their pass defense definitely struggled because of some of the other problems around. If you can have a guy like Javion Cole come around and be a really, really solid option, whether it's rotational or possibly finding his way into a starting spot, everything else becomes easier. You can move Jahdae Barron all around the field because he's one of those type of players that you can move all around the field. You can give Manny Muhammad a couple more snaps off, or at least give Manny Muhammad a little bit less of that aggressive, wide receiver one every single down of the game. So I think Javion Cole is one of those guys that just opens a lot of doors. I've talked about this before on here, but a lot of the position groups around the country aren't necessarily bad by any means. They usually just need that one person to step up to make everyone else kind of fit into their spots. I think Javion Cole could be one of those guys that if he steps up into that second in that backup spot at one of those corner positions and can play really consistent, good football, the entire rest of this back end is really going to benefit a ton from that. Moving on to Georgia, they want that elite defense. There's no two ways about that, and it starts with a guy like Christian Miller to me. When you look at this defensive line, I love Nazir Stackhouse. I really like Warren Brinson. I think they're both really good players. You need more than that, and you need guys that are going to be outright difference makers, and frankly, we saw what Nazir Stackhouse was a year ago. We saw what Warren Brinson was, and I would be surprised if they made enough of a step forward to be those game wreckers that Georgia has had on the defensive front in the past. Christian Miller is a guy that I think could be that. I think he's an absolute monster, super athletic, someone that can totally play pretty much wherever you want him to on the line of scrimmage, whether you want to kick him out to the 3 technique or even to the 4-eye technique, you can do that. If you want to play him inside at the 1 or the 2-eye, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So a very athletic kid, definitely can do a lot of things on the defensive front. Frankly, when I look at this Georgia team, I think Xavier McLeod and him are the two that, at least on that defensive front, that can make this a Georgia defense, that can make this a dominant front that absolutely, controls the pace of the game, the entire game, and could really, really open up so many doors for this defense. So when you look at this top line, I don't necessarily love the defensive tackles at Georgia, but I think you have that athleticism with Christian Miller, with Xavier McLeod on that back end, that if at least one of those guys, I'm tabbing Christian Miller, but it could be Xavier McLeod just as easily. If one of those guys steps up in big ways, then you'll be more than fine on that defensive front. I feel pretty confident about that. And then Johnny Aguero is someone I'm watching very, very closely. He has a ton on his shoulders coming in at that nickel position because the guy that just walked out the door was one of the better at that position that I have ever seen. Javon Bullard was an absolute monster for Georgia. He was everywhere that he needed to be. He was a really hard hitter, could play tight ends in coverage, could play running backs in coverage, did everything that you want a nickel to do, and was a great communicator on top of that. So everything that you needed from him, he did. Johnny Aguero is now stepping in, and you got to be that guy. You're going to have to be an elite communicator. You're going to have to be diverse in the way that you can get around coverages and play the run and do a ton of different things on that side of the ball. But overall, I think when you look at this UGA back end, there are some questions. There are some questions more in the depth than anything else. I like the front line that they have, but they are going to play some young guys with KJ Bolden, with Ellis Robinson III, a ton of guys that are going to have to make some big-time plays. But I think Johnny Aguero, if he can hold down that nickel position, if you don't have to worry about that nickel and you feel confident that he's going to walk into this year and be totally dominant at that position the same way Javon Bullard was a year ago, you'll be fine. It's a total stabilizer for this back end where you have that nickel position, you have your free safety, you feel pretty confident in what Dalen Everett's going to be this upcoming year. I think Daniel Harris, on the other side, and Julian Humphrey is going to be really good players, but overall, you need that catalyst. You need to make sure that as many things are ironclad in this back end as possible, and if Johnny Aguero walks into the season with being as confident as anyone and they feel confident in him, I think this back end is going to be just about as good as you can find across the country. But let's get into Oregon, and Derek Harmon is the guy I want to start with. He has gotten a lot of talk in fall camp, and we'll break that down in the next segment, but he is someone that came over from Michigan State and is huge for this team this upcoming year. He played all 12 games last year for Michigan State, had 10 starting assignments, 40 tackles, definitely made some really good plays, 2.5 sacks. He was around. There's no two ways about that. I think led Michigan State in interior defensive line snaps, so he can play a lot. He doesn't seem like he's going to be the starter. It sounds like Keon Hudson-Ware is going to be the starter at one of those defensive tackle positions next to Jamari Caldwell. But Derek Harmon's going to play, and he's going to play a ton, and frankly, they absolutely need him to be a big-time player. They need him to be that stifling defensive front that he absolutely is capable of being. So when you put together him, Jamari Caldwell, Keon Hudson-Ware, when you have a ton of other, Amari Washington is another defensive tackle over there, they're going to have plenty of guys to throw at you. You need a couple of these guys to really hit big, and frankly, I think Derek Harmon's going to be one of those guys. So I feel pretty good about this defensive tackle group, if I'm being totally honest. I think they have plenty of guys to throw at you, but I think Derek Harmon's going to be one that's going to just have to be huge for this team. And then Oregon's pass defense was a big-time issue in last year, where that was probably the difference between them getting to the playoff and not. When you walk into those Washington games, there were just a couple of plays where this back end just did not look where they needed to be. They did a lot to get that in place, and the biggest one, or not the biggest one, because they brought in Jabbar Muhammad, Cam Alexander, a ton of guys on that back end, but bringing in someone like Sione Luala is a huge pickup. I think this is a guy coming out of JUCO, number 2 JUCO transfer this past year, and was the number 1 guy at the corner position coming out of San Mateo College. But this is someone that usually you would let those guys get up to speed. Usually those guys wouldn't have to play right away, and you'd be able to kind of get them up to speed when it comes to a Power 4 level compared to a JUCO level. It's an entirely different world. So usually they would have some time. That's not necessarily the case this time around. You do have Jabbar Muhammad and Cam Alexander holding down those two spots for the time being, but you're going to need depth. You're going to need Dante Manning. You're going to need Luala. You're going to need some of these guys to really play big-time snaps against some of the Ohio States of the world. And if you can't hold up against them, you're going to have a problem holding up against Texas and holding up against Georgia and holding up against all of the teams that you want to beat and are going to have to beat to win a national title. So someone like Sione Luala, I think, is someone that absolutely is going to be huge for this team, is absolutely going to play big time snaps. And frankly, if you don't want to go over to a ton of freshmen playing on your back end, he's going to be someone that's going to have to be huge for them. So overall, I think they have a ton of guys on that front line that I feel really confident in that back end. The depth I don't necessarily love on that back end. So someone like Sione Luala absolutely is someone that could step into that role. And then you get into Ohio State, one of the teams that everyone's watching very, very closely, and they're watching it for very one reason. It's Will Howard. Everyone wants to know, what is Will Howard going to do in fall camp, and is he going to separate the way that he didn't in spring camp? Because frankly, if I'm being honest, I thought he would have taken it by now. I thought he would have taken full control of this offense. Now, learning a new offense with the OC change that happened a little bit later on in the process than you would have liked obviously plays a part in this, but it definitely adds a little bit of worry to me. We'll get into him in the next segment here, but he has to take full control. It doesn't have to be perfect football. It doesn't have to be, A+ football start to finish, but he has to know where everyone's going to be. He has to know all of the different reads he has to go through. He has to know, how these guys like to come out of their routes and how Carnell Tate likes to run over the middle, or how Emeka Egbuka likes to run his comeback routes, how Jeremiah Smith runs the fade and where to put that ball. All of these little things are going to be the difference between Ohio State reaching their goal and not this year. So I do think it's going to be very interesting, but it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect. But I need to go into this season as an Ohio State fan, hypothetically. I need to go into this season saying, if I'm down 7 and with 4 minutes left in Eugene, Oregon, can he orchestrate an offense with him being the main point? Not the wide receivers on the outside, not this incredible running group that you have, with Will Howard at the helm, with Will Howard making all of the plays that need to be made. Is he the guy that is going to be able to do that? So I think walking out of fall camp, you'll know a lot about Will Howard. We won't know everything until the season starts, but absolutely will be a huge fall camp for him just to take control of this position and say that it is his and he will not be dominated by any means this upcoming year. And it's still a big time question as of right now. The other guy I want to touch on is Josh Simmons. He kind of goes with Will Howard because his success is Will Howard's success in a lot of ways. You absolutely have to have this guy be a big-time player for you at that left tackle position, and he was a good player a year ago. There's no two ways about that. He absolutely made some good plays throughout the year, but he wasn't where you needed to be. And he absolutely can develop into a first-round talent type of guy, but it's got to start with a really good fall camp. I do think he's someone that holds a lot in this offense. If they're going to be dominant, then Josh Simmons absolutely has to be dominant. So it'll be fun to watch that kind of develop throughout fall camp. But let's get into fall camp. Let's get into all of the updates that we need to know about fall camp. Right after this break, we'll break down everything you need to know about a ton of different teams around the country because there's so much stuff coming out. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the players that need to take full advantage of fall camp and definitely leave a big time impression going into the year because their teams are going to need them in fall and definitely will be a huge topic of conversation as we go into fall. But let's get into some fall camp intel. There is so much stuff happening all around the country. Fall camp is fully underway. Some people are starting to put pads on. Some really cool things happening around the country as we get much, much closer to this thing kicking off. But let's get into this and let's start over in Boulder, Colorado, where there was a lot of news that came out over the last little bit. Let's just put it that way. But on Friday, they got underway for their fall camp workouts and a lot of different things kind of came out from that. Obviously, when you're talking about Colorado, there's going to be plenty of things that come out. Obviously, there were a number of people that didn't love the Instagram handle on the back of the jersey. I don't love it either, but that's beside the point. There was a huge story that came out yesterday around some of the players that have left Colorado, and it wasn't necessarily glowing. Let's just leave it at that. I will touch on it tomorrow, but absolutely is a huge story and something that could not be great for Dion. Let's just leave it at that for right now. But one of the big things coming out of fall camp for them is the fact that it sounds like you are not touching Travis Hunter. You are not touching any of the wide receivers. You are not touching any of the quarterbacks throughout this fall camp, even when they are fully padded. And I totally understand that. These are two of the guys that, if you were going to be successful this year as Colorado, they have to be on the field. There's no two ways about that. There is no argument against that. So I fully understand those two guys being away from contact. I do think this is a moniker for just where they're at in terms of depth. I will say, there's not a lot of teams that want to go into fall camp saying we have to protect this player, and this player, and they cannot be touched the entire time, because that's not the way you want to go about business. You want to play football. You want to get into that. So all of that stuff definitely makes sense. But I do think it's one of those things that Colorado has to do some things that other teams don't. They have to be a little bit more careful in fall camp because they're walking a little bit more of a tightrope than some of these other teams are when it comes to depth and that type of thing. So I don't think it's all that crazy. I do think it's something that could hurt them in week one, just getting up to pace when a team like North Dakota State comes into town. They're going to hit you, and they're going to hit you pretty hard. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a crazy decision by any means. Moving on to Ohio State, Carnell Tate continues to be the story coming out of Columbus, Ohio, and I think that's a really, really good sign for this wide receiver group because Emeka Egbuka is going to be good. I'm not really worried about him. I think he's going to be, at the very least, a good player for them. Jeremiah Smith is going to make plays. I don't necessarily know how big of a role he plays in this offense throughout the year, but I do know he's going to make at least enough plays to make some headlines. I can promise you that. So having someone like Carnell Tate step up the way that he has, and Brandon Ennis also is getting really, really good reviews, those are the guys that you likely want to get good reviews, because then you go 4 deep at the very least, and then you got Kojo Antwi and a ton of other guys that absolutely can make some noise. So I think it's a really good sign for this group just being totally unguardable overall, is Carnell Tate making a big-time stride. And then you had Will Howard. Will Howard made a big-time play in fall camp, I believe on Saturday. He took a quarterback keeper 85 yards to the house, which is an absolutely huge thing. And frankly, it's one of the bigger reasons why I think he's going to win this job, almost regardless of how his fall camp goes. Not regardless, but in certain terms, he has a more slack than some of these other quarterbacks do, because the guy can get out and run. He can make some things happen with his legs, and especially in an offense like Chip Kelly's, you want that. So I don't think it's crazy to think that he maybe doesn't have the cleanest fall camp in the world, but is still able to go into the season as the starter and be able to kind of build into it. Now, I don't think that's the best thing for Ohio State, but absolutely could be something that happens. Overall, Ohio State's first padded practice sounds like it's either coming up here pretty soon or already happened, and the defense was very, very excited and has been as dominant as we all expected. So that's just kind of business as usual at this point. But let's move over to Penn State, and let's talk about Max Granville. He's a freshman defensive end that is really getting rave reviews coming out of Penn State camp with all the staff, and a lot of the different beat reporters around there are just speaking very glowingly about this kid. And it might be someone that they need when you lose edge rushers like Adisa Isaac and like Chop Robinson. Even with someone like Abdul Carter moving to that position, you're going to need other guys. So it's very possible that this is a contributor this year for Penn State, and they could need him to be a contributor pretty early on. They also had Kavion Keys and defensive end Jameel Lyons, were placed on interim suspension. Not really sure what the story is around there, but definitely could be a huge thing. These are depth pieces for this Nittany Lions defense that is going to need depth one way or the other. They're going to need guys at every single position that can play big-time snaps. So it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. If they go into the year without those guys, it definitely becomes a little bit more of a tightrope walk on that defensive side of the ball. And then you move over to Oregon. It's all about the wide receivers and the DBs out in Eugene right now. They are speaking just ridiculously glowingly about this wide receiver group. They love Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart. Obviously, those are two of the best guys in the country. But then Jerrion Dickey is getting a ton of love. Greg Bryant Jr., who had some injury troubles last year but is a very talented player, is still there. You also have Trayshawn Holden. It's ridiculous the amount of wide receivers that Oregon has at their disposal. So it sounds like they feel very confident in that, and it's really showing early. On the other side of that, the back end is coming along. It sounds like it's not necessarily fully there yet. They feel very confident in the talent level that they have on that back end, and I would as well if you're looking at that talent level. But overall, it sounds like it just hasn't quite come together that the way, at least right now, it's very early on in camp. Definitely will make big time strides before the season starts, but something to watch. You know, you want to make that big time stride, and frankly, I think that might be the biggest difference between 2023 and 2024 is how much of a big time stride can you make on the back end of that defense. So it'll be definitely something to watch. If they get torched the entire time, obviously these are very good wide receivers they're going up against, but Ohio State's coming with roughly the same exact group when it comes to the talent level at that wide receiver position. So they're going to have to come together one way or the other. Whether it's in fall camp or throughout the season, I don't know, but that back end's going to have to come together if they want to win a national title. And then a ton of talk about Derek Harmon, just being a super athletic kid, someone that they absolutely love having on campus, and I think he's going to be a big-time player for them. We talked about him in the last segment. He has to be. It sounds like he's doing just that, at least to start fall camp. Now let's get into Clemson, and there are a ton of things coming out of Clemson. The biggest thing to me is it sounds like the intensity of these practices is just a little bit higher. It sounds like they know what they're up against this year. They know that they're kind of backed into a corner a little bit. They have to be ready to roll this upcoming year, and if they're not, then there are going to be a lot of people on the other side of it that are ready to make fun of them. There's no two ways about that. But one of the biggest things is Matt Luke came back from retirement. He was the UGA O-line coach, retired, and then came back to the sport as the O-line coach at Clemson. It sounds like he's doing a ton of really good work at that position. Now, they have a lot of good players, Blake Miller being the main among them at right tackle, I believe, maybe left tackle. That would be right tackle if I'm looking at it correctly. So at that right tackle position, they have a lot of really good players on that offensive line, 4 returning starters, but it sounds like Matt Luke has brought a level of intensity that just hasn't quite been there over the last couple of years, and they definitely do need around this time of year. And then Peyton Page, a veteran defensive lineman, was talking about just kind of the energy in these practices and how everyone is holding everyone very much accountable. It sounds like the defensive linemen, or maybe it was the edges that I read, had trotted onto the field and were taking their time getting ready for a drill, and the defensive line coach sprinted out there and made sure that they got ready quickly and got to work. So it sounds like there is a little bit of aggression, a little bit of intensity around Clemson this year, and they know that this year's huge for them. They have to deliver this upcoming year, or on the other side of it could be a very tough time with teams like Miami and Florida State and NC State and Virginia Tech, all of these teams rising. You're a team that could stumble this year and never be able to find your way back. So there's a lot of different things happening at Clemson, but it feels like a lot of positive things, at least early on in fall camp. So definitely a good news for all the Tiger fans out there. But let's get into Miami, and JoJo Trader is making a ton of noise. Josiah Trader was a very talented 4-star wide receiver coming out of, I believe, the 2023 class, if I'm not mistaken. A very talented kid, and when I look at this wide receiver room for Miami, it's one of the best in the country when you talk about the top line. Sam Brown, also someone that has gotten incredibly good reviews early on in camp, so they did really well when it comes to the wide receiver position in general. But I do think when you talk about this wide receiver group, they're going to need a couple more guys. And I think JoJo Trader is absolutely someone that might just find his way into a starting position right next to Xavier Restrepo, maybe Jacoby George, maybe Sam Brown. There's so many options out there. So they definitely have a kind of embarrassment of riches right now over in Miami. And another one was just added to the pile with JoJo Trader making a ton of big-time plays early on. So that'll be something to watch. And then Myshel Powell was talking about kind of the fit that he has at Miami. Says he feels really confident where he is right now. Said that the intensity at those practices are at a different level than they ever have been, at least than they have been in his college career, which was over at Washington before. But he also talked about Zaquan Patterson, which is a very talented freshman safety that they have really, really high hopes for. And Mychel Powell feels very confident in him. He said he could leave as one of the great Miami safeties that we've ever seen. And if that were the case, they would feel very confident about this team going into this year, and especially that back end that was a big-time question coming into this year. Maybe Zyquan Patterson can make that just a little bit easier. And then Florida got some not-so-great news, and it could be really bad news if it, continues on here for a little bit. Montrell Johnson, the star running back, went down with an injury and is reportedly week to week. We don't know exactly what the injury is or how severe it is as of right now, but if that guy's not in the game for Miami, it's going to be a problem. I can promise you that. There is no two ways that there are a ton of teams that don't want injuries across the board. There are a couple of teams around the country that can't have injuries. Florida's one of them. They absolutely have to have guys like Montrell Johnson on the field, guys like Eugene Wilson on the field. But on the other side of things, obviously a terrible news for them, and definitely something that we'll be watching very closely. If he's on the field for Miami, he'll be a factor. If he, is not on the field, then I like the pieces that they have behind him. I don't necessarily know if they're good enough to win that game against Miami, but that'll obviously be something we'll unpack as the season comes closer. But on the outside, they feel very confident in this wide receiver group. It sounds like Graham Mertz is, really coming along as a quarterback, picking up where he left off last year and doing really, really good stuff. So not a worry at quarterback by any means, but Elijah Badger is the guy that I really want to talk about because he's gotten so many different people praising him throughout this time. And I think the biggest one was obviously Billy Napier has really sung his praises and has done a ton around this player in particular, and it's someone that they absolutely need to hit. Right next to Eugene Wilson, you need another guy, and he will be a big-time player. And then DJ Lagway made some big-time plays at that practice and just gave you a little glimpse of what you could see in the future if you're a Gators fan. But definitely will be a lot of stuff to watch. We'll probably do this almost every day, maybe every couple of days, because there's new stuff that comes out almost every day, and we'll break it down for you guys on here. But let's take our last break, and then we'll get into recruiting. We'll break down all of the different things happening around a big-time weekend in recruiting right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different intel from around all of the fall camps around the country. We will continue to do that probably about every day. I think we're going to do it tomorrow because there was some news that came out early today that I need to break down for you all. But let's get into a little bit of a recruiting update here. Oregon and Auburn got the big-time commits of the weekend, and there was some big-time commits in 2026 that I want to break down for you all. So let's get into this, and let's start with that Oregon commit. Trey McNutt, the 5-star safety, the number 2 safety in the country, or number 1, depending on where you look. He is a very talented kid, no doubt about it. And it was a big-time recruitment for Oregon. They finally got it under wraps. It was Ohio State early, then it was A&M pushing late, but Oregon was the stabilizer here. They were the team that was in it from start to finish, and they got it done. Now the top 4 safeties in the country are all going to the Big Ten. 2 are heading to Michigan with, I believe, Ivan Stewart and Kainoa Winston, if I'm not mistaken. Ohio State grabbed one in Fahim Deline. And then finally, Oregon gets one in Trey McNutt. So a ton of talented safeties heading on over to the Big Ten. The number 5 guy in the country at that position leads me to my next team. Eric Winters leads me to my next team. And Auburn picks up a massive commitment from Jared Smith, an elite in-state defensive edge rusher, 6'6", 250, exactly where you want him to be if he's coming out of high school right now, an absolute beast of a human. He was kind of a Auburn-South Carolina battle towards the end. Georgia was in it early on, but kind of had tapered over the last couple of weeks, and Auburn's just on a ridiculous run. There's no two ways about that. They are locking down Alabama in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, if I'm being totally honest, at least since I've been really following recruiting. That's belonged to Alabama. Auburn's not only out recruiting Alabama in Alabama right now, they're dominating them. I believe they have 6 of the top 10 guys in the state. 2 of the top 10 guys are finding their way up to Columbus, Ohio. One of the guys is finding his way over to Austin, Texas, and one of the guys is going to Tuscaloosa, and that's the number 10 guy in Alabama right now. So Auburn's doing exactly what they need to do. Obviously, with NIL and all of the different things at your disposal, locking down your state isn't quite as important as it was, 5-10 years ago, but it's still a really huge deal. So absolutely huge for Auburn in that respect. And moving on here, Demetrius Samuel Jr. is someone I want to talk about. He flipped his commitment from Syracuse to Florida, and not only that, he flipped his class from 2026 to 2025. So he is going to reclassify and likely be on campus in January. This is a big-time one because when you look at who's up there at Syracuse, it is Fran Brown. When you have someone committed to Fran Brown, you can feel very confident. I'll just put it this way. You can feel very confident that that is a very good player. Wherever he's going to play on the field, likely will be a back-end player, either safety or corner for them. But I do think this is one of those where you can trust Fran Brown to get the right guys, to evaluate the right guys and offer the right guys. So if you can steal one from him, you got to feel pretty confident. Even though it says Syracuse to Florida, you don't think too much of it. Think about the head coach that's up there at Syracuse, and it'll make a lot more sense why this is a huge deal for Florida. So Florida continues to do what a lot of people didn't expect them to do, including myself, which is recruit at a very high level right now. Jaden Breaker is someone I want to talk about. He flipped his commitment from South Carolina to LSU this past weekend. He's from Snellville, Georgia, 6'3", 217, just a really, really good size for a linebacker, and had been committed to South Carolina for about a month. So might want to watch this one a little bit. There's a possibility for another flip at some point, but overall, he is LSU's right now, and that's a huge win. LSU continues to prioritize the side of the ball that they very much need to on the defensive side, and it'll be really interesting to watch this develop, but you need that guy in the middle of your defense. Once Harold Perkins leaves, you need that linebacker to step in and play a big role. Maybe it's this guy right here. So definitely a big-time pickup there. Staying in the linebacker world, Jaden Perlette is absolutely someone I want to talk about. He flipped his commitment from Georgia to USC. This was one that, frankly, he was not committed to Georgia for quite some time. Now, he was committed technically, but there were a lot of people around the Bulldog program that said, it's happening. We don't know what team, we don't know when, but it's happening, and the teams flip from time to time, but it landed on USC, a huge pickup for USC. UGA against USC has kind of been a fun recruiting battle, and I'm sure there are a couple other punches that will be thrown over the next little bit, but a huge pickup nonetheless. Absolutely need that guy to be the general of your defense going forward. I thought it was going to be Tackett Curtis as they started to rebuild this defense. He found his way over to Wisconsin. So now you need a new guy, and it's going to take a little bit of time to build out the talent level, but this is a huge addition nonetheless, and absolutely one that they needed. Darian Smith is someone I want to talk about, and a really talented defensive lineman that is committed to Tennessee, 6'3", 270 defensive lineman out of Baltimore. He picked Tennessee over Ohio State and Maryland. Elite run for Tennessee on the recruiting trail, especially on that defensive side of the ball. They're putting in work, and everything is going the way that they need it to go. There are so many things at Tennessee that just haven't been the way that they should have been over the last couple of years, talent acquisition being probably the main among them. That's no longer the case. They are beating out Ohio States for these kids. They are beating out Alabama. They are beating out Georgia and Texas. So they're doing the things that they have to do, and they're building a really, really special thing in Knoxville. When it blows up, I don't know, but a lot of things are going right. I can promise you that. And then 4-star wide receiver Kobe Howard. He is committed to Penn State, someone they needed. Frankly, when you look at Penn State, bring in as many wide receivers as you can. If you can get a 4-star wide receiver down from Florida, you feel really good. I can promise you that. This is one that they absolutely needed. A very versatile kid. You can line him up all over the field, and especially in Andy Kotelnicki's offense, there is a lot of wiggle room. And I think having one of these wide receivers out there is absolutely going to help them a ton. They got to keep bringing these guys in. They got to keep adding those wide receivers, those tight ends, everything that is a pass catcher. Go ahead and offer, because you absolutely need as many as you can get your hands on. And this is an absolutely great pickup for Penn State, and one that could set their offense up for real success going forward. And then in 2026, we are a little bit away from this, so I'll, fly through these a little bit quicker. But the number one quarterback in the country and the number one player in the country in 2026 has committed to Tennessee. Faison Brandon is a very, very talented player, 6'4", 202, absolute gunslinger, someone that's an absolute monster all over the field. And Tennessee, beasts in the quarterback recruiting market. When you talk about bringing in two number one quarterbacks over the last 2 cycles with Nico Iamaleava, and if Brandon signs, obviously. And then you have George McIntyre, who I think is going to be really, really good for this team. Jake Merklinger, who might get lost in the shuffle, but is still a very talented player that could play big-time snaps for them. QB recruiting is never really going to be a problem for Josh Heupel, but it's hitting a ceiling that, frankly, I didn't even know it had. So really, really impressive stuff from them. And then Jonas Williams, another 4-star quarterback out of that class. He is committed to Oregon, and this is something that has kind of been developing over the last couple of cycles, is get your quarterback and everything else will fall into place. That's exactly what Oregon did last cycle when they brought in Akili Smith. They had some guys on that in that group prior to that, but definitely adding him helped that out a ton, and adding the number 7 ranked quarterback in the country is absolutely going to help that. So starting with your quarterback and then building out from there is always a good strategy, and that's exactly what Oregon's going to do right here. And then Florida got another commit in the 2026 class, Devin Jackson, a safety that is very, very talented, 4-star out of Winter Garden, Florida. This is someone that definitely is going to play a big-time part in this program, and frankly, is more surprising to me because of the optics around that program. If you're a 2025 kid, I can understand buying into this. I can understand saying, even if this year isn't perfect, we can come in and fix everything and get this thing rolling with DJ Lagway at quarterback and all of that different stuff. A 2026 kid committing this early is very interesting to me, because it just proves that Florida is getting really good at selling whatever is in that building compared to what we think is in that building. So I think the perception around Florida is totally different than what everyone in that building feels, and it'll be really interesting to see that one develop. But obviously, this is one that will likely be defined by what happens on the field for Florida. So it'll be interesting to watch that class 2025 and 2026 develop over this upcoming year. But now I want to get into some scheduled commitments, and we'll start with Khalil Lockett. He is committing on Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Number 3 wide receiver in the country, according to On3, a very, very talented kid. Someone that, frankly, when you get up to the top couple of wide receivers in the country, you're splitting hairs. I think DeCorian Moore is the best in the country, but there are a number of guys that absolutely have a claim there. It seems like it's going to be Texas. Everything is pointing to Texas right now. A&M is making a push. Bama has made push in the last couple of weeks, but as of right now, it feels like Texas has been leading for quite some time and has held that lead just long enough to get this commitment. A lot can change very quickly, so we'll obviously update you with that as it comes, but as of right now, I would be a little bit surprised if it wasn't the Texas Longhorns here. Jonte Gilbert is someone I want to talk about, a 4-star corner out of Douglas High School in Atlanta, Georgia. He's going to commit on Saturday at 3 p.m. and a very, very talented kid. It sounds like NC State and UCF are the teams to beat here. It sounds like those are the teams that everyone is watching right now, and frankly, I would lean towards NC State, but UCF is doing incredible things on the recruiting trail and definitely is someone to worry about. The other team to worry about is Georgia. They're going to have to worry about that in-state school that, if Georgia comes around and, really goes after this kid, I would not be too surprised if he flipped that direction. As of right now, I would lean NC State or UCF, but UGA is sitting right there, and that's probably the worst team that you'd want to be sitting on the outskirts of your recruitment, because in the drop of a hat, they can make some noise and get a commitment from this kid. But the final one I want to talk about stays in the state of Georgia. Josh Petty is a top offensive tackle in this class, a 5-star that is set to commit a week from today, actually, at noon on next Monday, and we'll obviously update you when we get there. But this one's getting really interesting. Georgia Tech is picking up a ton of steam here, and this one is really, really weird because Florida State felt very confident about where they were at for the vast majority of this recruitment. And then Josh Petty went on a recruitment visit to Georgia Tech, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and a lot of things changed. The way that everyone was talking about this recruitment wasn't, Georgia Tech is in it. They have a shot to possibly win it if they get in the back door. To Georgia Tech might be the favorite in this recruitment right now, which would be absolutely insane. They added the number 10 offensive tackle in the country, Demola Ajidahun. The number 10 offensive tackle in the country. They added him, a great addition. If they add Josh Petty as well, that will be the best offensive tackle duo that you have had in this recruiting class, and it will be going to Atlanta, Georgia to play for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. So a huge pickup for Brent Key. That's obviously his position, so not necessarily too crazy, but if they get Josh Petty, this is a really good recruiting class for the Jackets and one that they can build off and become a team to be worried about in that ACC conference going forward. So a lot of recruiting updates, a lot of updates in general, which is why we are going at 1 hour, 10 minutes right now. So let's wrap this thing up here. That'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. With the Olympics around, we have incredible people doing all types of work to cover every bit of the Olympics you can want. Now, for me, it's college football season. That's what I'm focused on, but there are plenty of people around GSMC that can get you updated on everything you need to know in Olympics, in football, with the NFL coming, everything. But let's just leave it at that. Everything in the world of sports, we totally have you covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.